Dawn crept over the barracks in a thin silver line, brushing frost across the windows as the bugle call shattered the quiet. German prisoners stepped out into the biting morning air, boots crunching on snow that had hardened overnight into pale glass. The roll call yard steamed with the faint warmth drifting from the kitchen, oatmeal pots boiling, bread rising, the smell carrying a strange comfort that many tried not to acknowledge. A guard tower cut a dark silhouette against the rising light, its shape stretching long shadows across the parade ground. The prisoners lined up in stiff rows, breath fogging, shoulders trembling beneath thin wool coats never meant for a Canadian winter. Somewhere beyond the pines, an engine growled, then stopped. A truck door slammed. The prisoners turned. A group of Canadians, soldiers and civilians, stepped down, arms full of parcels wrapped in brown paper and string. Gifts. Here? One German whispered, Warum würden Sie uns etwas bringen? Why would they bring us anything? And for the first time that winter, the silence of the camp shifted. By 1943 and 1944, the war in Europe had produced more prisoners than Britain could handle. With cities bombed, resources stretched thin, and camps overflowing, British officials turned to a distant ally, whose vast land and relative safety made it the ideal place to send thousands of German POWs. Canada, quiet, far removed, and impossibly large, became the unexpected endpoint for soldiers who had once imagined either victory or death, never exiled to a cold new world across the Atlantic. The prisoners were gathered from battlefields, stretching from North Africa to Italy, loaded onto ships under heavy guard, and escorted across waters haunted by U-boats. For many, the ocean crossing was the first moment they realized the war might stretch far beyond Europe's borders. When they finally glimpsed the eastern Canadian coast, Halifax, Quebec, small harbors tucked beneath cliffs and pines, the sight felt unreal. Here was a land untouched by bombs, where chimneys still smoked peacefully, and the sky was wide enough to swallow an entire convoy. Once ashore, their processing followed strict rules laid down by the Canadian government and shaped by the Geneva Convention. They were not to be starved, beaten, or humiliated. They were to be housed, fed, and put to useful work, with records kept of everything. And although many German prisoners refused to admit it aloud, they sensed immediately that Canada intended to treat them far better than Germany treated its own captives. Trains carried the men inward, deep into the country's forests and prairies. The view from the windows became its own lesson. Endless spruce and fir trees blurred into white winterscapes. Rivers wound through untouched valleys. Small towns passed with children waving at the cars, unaware of the war-torn histories of the men inside. One POW later wrote in his diary that the landscape felt like a world that had somehow avoided the madness we brought with us. Inside the wooden train cars, guards handed out bread, cheese, and even small squares of chocolate. Some prisoners stared at the food before touching it, convinced at first that it must be bait or punishment disguised as kindness. Others, exhausted by months of war, simply ate in silence, trying not to imagine what their families were eating back home. A few, when the guards were not looking, saved half their rations to trade or share later inside the camp. Old habits from Europe's scarcity clinging to them, even in this new land. When they finally arrived, the camps themselves appeared strangely modest. Instead of stone fortresses or concrete military compounds, many Canadian camps consisted of long wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and the isolating vastness of wilderness. The forests seemed designed to swallow escapees. The winters came down like iron gates, deep snow, howling winds, temperatures that numbed fingers in minutes. For the first time, some POWs wondered if these forests were more of a prison than any walls could ever be. The guards overseeing the camps were often older men or young recruits, soldiers not yet deployed overseas. They carried rifles and followed protocols with discipline, but they lacked the hatred many Germans expected from their enemy. Canada, after all, had not been bombed by the Luftwaffe. Its cities had not burned. Its civilians had not been slaughtered. To many guards, these POWs were not symbols of genocide or destruction. They were simply captured soldiers, men doing what they had been ordered to do before ending up on the wrong side of the war. For German prisoners raised in rigid hierarchy and nationalist fervor, this attitude was jarring. They expected cruelty and propaganda. Instead, they saw guards sharing jokes, handing out tobacco, even discussing hockey scores among themselves as if the war were happening on another planet. Some POWs assumed it was a trick meant to break their morale. Others simply didn't know how to respond and kept to themselves. Cultural barriers made the situation even more awkward. English and German clashed constantly. Misunderstandings during roll calls, confused orders during work assignments, and the shared frustration of two groups of men forced together by a conflict neither of them could control. Yet, despite the tension, tiny gestures began to soften the atmosphere. A guard miming instructions until laughter broke the silence. A prisoner offering a cigarette. A Canadian soldier trying to pronounce a German name and failing so badly that even the sternest POW cracked a smile. Still, nothing prepared the prisoners for the moment that would truly unsettle everything they believed about their captors. The war had taught them to expect harshness, suspicion, even hatred. But one winter morning, when a truck stopped at the gate and Canadians, ordinary civilians, not soldiers, stepped out carrying packages wrapped in brown paper, the German prisoners were struck silent. Gifts. For them. For men who had once marched under Hitler's flag. And as the parcels were carried past the guards, many prisoners felt something unexpected tighten in their chests. Not fear, but confusion. A quiet question began to rise among them, a question whispered between chapped lips and frost-stung breath. Why would enemies bring gifts? Their understanding of the world was about to change. The winter the German POWs spent in Canada felt longer than any they had known in Europe. Snow piled against the barracks until the windows looked buried, and the sound of boots crunching outside became the constant heartbeat of camp life. The prisoners woke each morning to the same routine: roll call, breakfast, work assignments, return, lights out. Yet under that rhythm, a deeper transformation was unfolding, one shaped by distance, by culture, and by the strange gentleness of a land they had been taught to fear. Most of the men had come from battlefields where the war had stripped them of certainty. In North Africa, many had surrendered under blazing sun and starvation. In Italy, their units had collapsed under relentless Allied pressure. Some arrived carrying guilt, not for personal crimes, but for having survived when their comrades had not. Others arrived still steeped in ideology, convinced the Allies would humiliate or torture them in revenge for German aggression. Canada's calmness disrupted all of these expectations. The camp was fenced, yes, but it was not cruel. The guards enforced discipline, but they did not relish it. There was an order here that felt almost moral. Even the labor assignments challenged their assumptions. Many prisoners were sent into the surrounding forests for timber work, cutting trees needed for the Canadian war effort. The work was exhausting, but it was fair. They were given proper tools. Lunch was brought out to them. On especially frigid days, a guard would allow them to warm their hands around the engine block of the truck. One POW later wrote, "It was the first time I realized our captors were men with consciences, not monsters." Between the prisoners themselves, the dynamic was complicated. Some remained fiercely loyal to the Reich and tried to impose ideological control over their fellow POWs. They held meetings in whispered corners, monitored those who seemed too friendly with Canadians, and kept alive the stories they were raised with. The Allies were deceitful. Canadians were puppets of Britain. Kindness was a trap. But as weeks turned into months, cracks spread through these convictions. Kindness repeated becomes difficult to dismiss. The guards, too, evolved in their perceptions. At first, many watched the prisoners with suspicion. They had heard stories of escape attempts in other camps, of secret Nazi cells, of violence between factions of prisoners. But the Germans in this forest camp were mostly exhausted farmers, clerks, cobblers, and school teachers turned soldiers. Outside of a few hardline loyalists, most simply wanted peace, food, and the promise of seeing their families again. Some guards found themselves talking with prisoners through broken bits of English and German, laughing at misunderstandings, arguing over sports, trading bits of culture that had nothing to do with war. Distance from the front made everything easier. Here, the conflict felt suspended, as if the forest itself absorbed the echo of artillery and replaced it with the whisper of snow. Canadian newspapers occasionally reached the camp, and prisoners pored over them, though the guards removed sensitive war content. One POW, a former university student, told a guard, "This is the first place I have breathed without fear since 1939. The guard replied, half joking, "Good. We'd rather you breathe than freeze." Yet the psychological divide remained. Germans carried with them a fear of humiliation, of being seen as defeated men. Canadians, on the other hand, carried a fear that too much kindness might be exploited. Both sides were cautious, moving slowly, learning each other through small moments, a shared shovel, a borrowed coat, a gesture of thanks. It was not friendship yet, but it was no longer hostility. Then came the rumors, soft at first, then louder. Civilians were requesting permission to deliver Christmas parcels to the POWs. The idea startled even the guards. Many came from nearby farming communities and saw the POWs working in the forests or fields. To them, these men were not symbols of tyranny, but tired foreigners shivering in Canadian snow. Some families, moved by faith or compassion, gathered supplies: socks, scarves, apples, homemade jam, tobacco pouches, even letters with simple greetings like, "May God keep you safe until your family sees you again." Inside the camp, the anticipation felt unreal. Prisoners debated endlessly. Was it allowed? Was it propaganda? Did Canadians pity them or respect them? Some officers insisted it must be a trick, but most men deep down felt something far more human, the fragile hope that someone beyond the wire saw them as people, not enemies. When the morning finally came, the prisoners stood at roll call with strained expressions, pretending not to care. The forest was silent, the snow reflecting the pale sky. Then the sound of an approaching truck rolled through the camp. Every head turned. Guards shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to prepare the men for what was about to unfold. The truck stopped. Civilians climbed down, arms full, packages wrapped in brown paper, faces unsure, but earnest. For the prisoners, the moment felt impossible, like a story told to children, not to soldiers. They stared, frozen not by the cold, but by disbelief. This land, this distant enemy nation, was about to hand them gifts. And as the parcels crossed through the gate, something inside the camp, inside, the men themselves, began to break open. Among the first shocks the German prisoners experienced in Canada was the simple, disarming reality of food. They had expected thin rations, the kind given to beaten men. Instead, the camp kitchens produced meals that, though plain, were far richer than what many of them had eaten during the final years of the war. Oatmeal steamed in metal pots each morning. Bread was soft, not stale. Potatoes arrived in heaps. Meat, small portions but real, appeared more often than they imagined possible for prisoners. Some of the men stared at their plates in quiet disbelief, unsure whether to trust what they saw. Others ate too quickly, as if someone might snatch the food away. A few, trained by years of scarcity, even hid pieces of bread inside their pockets until guards gently told them it wasn't necessary. The real astonishment came when they encountered the taste of Canadian kitchens: soups thickened with barley, pies sweetened with fruit, coffee boiled strong and dark. The guards joked that Canadian coffee could wake the dead, and the prisoners soon learned it was no exaggeration. Cold mornings at roll call became more bearable when a guard walked past carrying a pot, steam rising into the snow-heavy air. Sometimes he offered a cup to a shivering prisoner, and the gesture felt like a breach in the invisible wall between captor and captive. Food changed the men in subtle ways. It restored weight to hollow faces, steadied hands that once trembled constantly, and brought back memories of home: mothers stirring pots, wives serving Sunday meals, the smell of bread from village bakeries untouched by war. And for many POWs, this nourishment carried a quiet, profound message. Their captors did not wish to degrade them. They wished, unexpectedly, to sustain them. Clothing and hygiene became another quiet battlefield where expectations collided with reality. Many German prisoners arrived in Canada with uniforms worn thin from months of marching, fighting, and retreating. Knees torn open, boots cracked, stitching unraveling. The first winter storms exposed every weakness in their clothing. Cold seeped in through threadbare sleeves. Snow clung to wool until it smelled of damp despair. Some guards, noticing the men shiver during morning roll call, spoke with the quartermasters, and soon bundles of donated winter garments began appearing: scarves, mittens, thick socks, sometimes even Canadian wool coats that felt like armor against the north winds. The prisoners were stunned. In Germany, they had been taught that Allied nations were ruthless, eager for revenge. But here were their enemies handing them warmth. One prisoner wrote later, "It confused me more than any interrogation could have. Hygiene facilities, though basic, were far better than what many had known on the front lines. Hot water days became small celebrations. Men joked, steam rising around them, that this was the first time in years they could feel their skin instead of the grime of war. The guards complained that the prisoners used more soap than any Canadians they knew, but their teasing carried no cruelty, only the familiarity of men sharing the same frozen world. Slowly, routines of cleaning, shaving, and repairing clothing gave prisoners back a sense of dignity. The war had stripped them of structure, purpose, and humanity. Here, in the unlikely shelter of a Canadian forest camp, those pieces were returning. They did not yet understand what this meant, or how deeply it was preparing them for the moment when civilians would walk through the gates carrying gifts. The morning the civilians arrived still lived in the memories of German POWs decades later, as vivid as the moment they first laid down their weapons. Snow had fallen heavily during the night, leaving the camp muffled beneath a white silence that seemed too peaceful for a place built to hold defeated soldiers. The sky was a dull silver, the kind that made every sound feel distant. The men assembled for roll call, stamping their boots to fight the cold, breath rising in little clouds that vanished into the still air. A guard, usually cheerful, looked unusually alert as he scanned the horizon beyond the barbed wire. The prisoners followed his eyes. For a moment, there was nothing but the forest, tall black pines, heavy with snow. Then, faintly at first, a low rumble broke the quiet. An engine. Not military, slower, lighter, a civilian truck. Whispers rippled through the rows of prisoners. Some straightened, others frowned, wary. A few of the older soldiers looked resigned, as if expecting some new regulation or reprimand. No one imagined what was actually coming. The truck emerged between the trees, its tires cutting dark grooves into the fresh white snow. It rolled toward the gate, passed through after brief inspection, and stopped in the clearing. The doors opened, and out stepped not soldiers, not officers, but Canadian civilians, men and women bundled against the cold, arms laden with parcels wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. The shock among the prisoners was instantaneous. Men who had endured artillery explosions, night raids, and death marches stood rigidly frozen. They looked from the civilians to the guards, expecting an explanation. None came. Even the guards seemed awkward, unsure how to bridge the moment. One civilian, a middle-aged man with a red wool scarf, lifted a hand in greeting. It was not a military gesture, not an order, just a simple hello. Something so ordinary it felt extraordinary. A German prisoner whispered, barely loud enough for the man beside him to hear, Warum würden Feinde uns etwas bringen? Why? Why would enemies bring us anything? The parcels were carried across the yard toward a table set up near the barracks. The prisoners watched every movement as if afraid the entire scene might vanish if they blinked. The civilians placed the packages down gently, almost reverently as though they were offerings rather than supplies. When the camp commandant stepped forward to address the prisoners, his voice carried a mixture of pride and discomfort. You will each receive a parcel. These gifts come from local families. They asked permission to bring them as a gesture of goodwill during the holiday season. Holiday season. The words washed over the prisoners with strange warmth and sharper confusion. Germany was in ruins, families displaced, cities burning, and here, in a land nearly half a world away, people who had never met them had gathered food, socks, jam, mittens, tobacco, and small handwritten notes wishing peace. The distribution began slowly. Guards called names from a list, and prisoners stepped forward, some trembling, some stiff with pride they were trying desperately to hold on to. The first man approached the table. A Canadian woman handed him a parcel with both hands, looked him in the eyes, and said softly, "Stay warm, okay?" Her voice carried no fear, no judgment. The prisoner swallowed hard. He tried to speak but couldn't. Instead, he bowed his head, a soldier's instinctive gesture of respect, and stepped away. When he opened the parcel, his breath caught. Thick wool socks, a bar of chocolate, dried apples, a handwritten note. We hope this brings you comfort. We pray your family is safe. Another prisoner received a pair of mittens knitted by a child. The uneven stitching made several of the men smile. Tucked into the wool was a small drawing of a snowman and the words, in shaky English, "Merry Christmas to the German man." He held it as if it were made of glass. Some prisoners cried openly, not caring who saw. Others clenched their jaws, fighting the emotion rising in their chests. They had been told Canadians were enemies, yet here they stood, offering warmth. One man, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg, whispered to his friend, "If my son were taken prisoner, I would pray someone would show him this kindness." The gifts were simple, human, disarming. And in that moment, the barbed wire that surrounded the camp felt somehow thinner, less threatening, not because it had changed physically, but because the meaning of the place had shifted. The men inside were no longer just captives. They were human beings seen and acknowledged by the people outside. For the first time since their surrender, many felt the faint, almost painful stir of dignity returning, and this was only the beginning of what that day would become. As the parcels continued to be handed out, the atmosphere inside the camp changed in a way the guards could feel even before they understood it. Men who had stood in rigid lines just moments earlier now held small pieces of humanity in their hands, gifts wrapped in paper that smelled faintly of kitchens, homes, and hearth fires. Some of the prisoners lifted their parcels to their faces and breathed in deeply, as if the scent itself were a reminder that the world still contained warmth. A group of younger POWs, barely 20 years old, gathered near the edge of the yard. They, more than anyone, had been raised under the full weight of Nazi propaganda. They had absorbed since childhood the idea that enemies were cruel, inhuman, merciless. Now they stood staring at knitted scarves, tins of cookies, and letters written by children who had never seen war. The contradiction overwhelmed them. One of them muttered, "They care more about us than our own commanders did." The others nodded silently, unable to disagree. The guards, at first hesitant, began to relax. Some even exchanged small smiles with the civilians. A few stood nearby, arms folded, touched by the sight of hardened soldiers reduced to quiet gratitude. One guard, an older veteran who had fought in World War I, removed his cap and rubbed his eyes. "I never thought I'd live to see something like this," he whispered to a younger guard beside him. "Not in a time like this." The civilians did not linger long. Many had traveled miles through winter roads just to deliver these parcels. Before leaving, one elderly farmer approached the fence, looking at the prisoners beyond it. His voice carried gently across the snow. "War ends someday. Make it home safely. All of you." A long silence followed. The POWs listened to the truck as it drove away, its engine fading into the forest. Only when the sound disappeared completely did the spell seem to break. Men slowly dispersed, returning to their barracks with their parcels held close to their chests like fragile treasures. Inside the barracks, the emotional wave continued. Some prisoners opened their gifts immediately, passing items around, sharing bites of chocolate or spoonfuls of preserves. Others placed their parcels on their bunks and just stared at them, unable to bring themselves to open something so unexpected. For many, the gift represented more than its contents. It represented a crack in hatred, a softening of the world's edges. One prisoner sat on his bunk, holding a pair of thick wool socks. They were ordinary, slightly mismatched in color, clearly handmade. Inside the bundle, tucked between the folds of yarn, he found a note written in careful handwriting. "Dear soldier, I knit these for you. I hope they keep your feet warm. My papa is fighting in Europe. Maybe someone is helping him too." The man's eyes burned with tears he had not allowed himself to shed since the day he surrendered. Another man found a small prayer card inside his parcel. He was not religious, but the simple message, "Peace on earth, goodwill to men," felt like a balm he didn't know he needed. He pinned the card above his bunk, even though it violated regulations. The guard assigned to his barracks saw it, hesitated, and then turned away, pretending not to notice. Even those who had resisted the softening of their worldview, the ideological loyalists, the hardened NCOs, felt their certainty slipping. It was difficult to condemn an enemy whose civilians knitted scarves for prisoners. One staunch Nazi supporter tore open his parcel expecting it to be inferior, symbolic, or mocking. Instead, he found more care than he had received from his own officers on the front lines. He folded the scarf gently and said nothing for the rest of the day. Later that evening, as the camp grew quiet and lamps glowed through frost-covered windows, the prisoners gathered in small clusters. Some hummed Christmas tunes. A few men whispered memories of their families, what their children might be doing, how their wives might be managing without them. For the first time, the barracks felt less like cages and more like shelters. The guards, pacing their evening rounds, heard something unexpected. Laughter, soft, tentative, but real. It drifted out of the barracks like smoke from a rekindled fire. The emotional climax of the day arrived not during the parcel distribution, but afterward, when the prisoners began to write. Some wrote letters to their families, describing the kindness they had received. Others wrote diary entries, unsure if these words would survive the war, but needing to capture the moment for themselves. Today, the enemy treated us as men, not beasts. My heart does not know how to hold this. If this is what Canada is like, what else in the world have we been wrong about? That night, the camp slept more peacefully than it had in months. Men who had arrived hardened by battle, indoctrination, and desperation now lay with wool blankets pulled to their chins, small gifts tucked under their pillows. A few held letters they could not read. They didn't know enough English, but the handwriting itself felt kind. In the darkness, long after the lamps had been extinguished, one prisoner whispered into the silent barracks, "Maybe the world can forgive us." No one answered. They didn't need to. The gifts had spoken for everyone. When the war finally ended, the atmosphere inside the Canadian camps shifted once again, quietly at first, then with a weight that settled over the prisoners like a second winter. News arrived slowly, filtered through guards and newspapers, but each headline confirmed what many had already suspected. Germany had collapsed. Cities they loved were rubble, families displaced. The Reich that had promised victory had dissolved into surrender. The prisoners felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief that the fighting had stopped. Dread of what awaited them beyond the wire. Yet, amid this uncertainty, one truth kept returning to them: the kindness they had received inside these Canadian forests. The parcels, the warm clothing, the fair treatment, the small gestures of respect, all of it shaped their understanding of the world they were about to re-enter. Repatriation did not begin at once. For months, the prisoners remained in the camps as officials sorted paperwork, arranged transport ships, and evaluated whether any POW had collaborated with extremist factions inside the barracks. The waiting was agonizing. Men packed and repacked their belongings, wrote letters they could not send, and walked the perimeter fences as if trying to memorize the last place where they had felt safe. Some guards grew emotional as the men prepared to leave. Bonds had formed, quiet but unmistakable, formed not through friendship, but through the shared endurance of long winters and the silent acknowledgement of humanity between them. A few guards shook hands with prisoners on their final roll call. Others simply nodded, their eyes avoiding the moment too heavy to articulate. When the trucks came to take the men away, many prisoners looked back at the camp one last time. It was not a place they loved, but it was a place that had changed them, a place where they had learned that enemies were not always what propaganda painted them to be, a place where civilians had walked through gates with gifts instead of stones. On the transport ship back to Europe, several men opened their diaries for the first time in weeks. Their entries were hesitant at first, then full, then deeply personal. If Canada could treat us like this, maybe the world is not as broken as we feared. I leave this place with more hope than I ever carried into the war. The sea carried them home, but their hearts carried something else, something born on a winter morning, wrapped in brown paper and string. When the German prisoners finally stepped back onto European soil, they carried with them an emotional weight that was almost impossible to express. Many returned to towns that no longer existed, to families scattered or grieving, to a nation drowning in shame and reconstruction. Yet embedded within that devastation was a strange, quiet strength, something planted in them far from home, in Canadian forests where enemies had shown them unexpected mercy. Families listened with disbelief as the men told their stories. They spoke of warm clothing given freely during blizzards, of food that restored their strength, of guards who treated them with rigid fairness, and of the civilians who had brought gifts to the camp, despite having no obligation to do so. Some listeners wept, not because the generosity was grand, but because it proved that the world had not entirely hardened, even in the last years of the war. Fathers told their children, The Canadians treated us like human beings. Mothers heard the stories and whispered, "Then perhaps God did not abandon us after all." Young men, carrying guilt they could not yet name, found a fragile path toward forgiveness. For many former POWs, the greatest emotional conflict came from comparing their treatment abroad to the realities of life in their defeated homeland. Roads were in ruins, food was scarce, families were displaced. Yet these men had returned with boxes of letters, knitted scarves, and memories of kindness that stood in painful contrast to the suffering at home. Some felt guilty for having been so well cared for in captivity. Others held on to those memories as proof that decency could survive even the darkest chapters of history. Over the years, the men continued to write in diaries or record oral histories or tell their grandchildren stories that began with the same moment, the day civilians walked into their prison with gifts. That, one former soldier said decades later, was the day I stopped believing everything I had been taught. When they looked back on the war, that memory did not erase the horrors they had seen. It did not absolve anyone of guilt, but it softened something inside them, a recognition that even in the midst of destruction, humanity still flickered somewhere, refusing to be extinguished. And many believed that flicker had guided them home. War leaves behind 1,000 broken truths, cities turn to ash, uniforms stiff with mud, memories that flicker like firelight before dimming into silence. But among all the wreckage, moments of gentle defiance sometimes survive, moments where human beings choose compassion over hatred, dignity over vengeance. For the German POWs who passed through the forests of Canada, that moment came wrapped in brown paper, tied with simple string, carried by hands that owed them nothing. Years later, the men would struggle to explain it. How could an enemy nation, untouched by German suffering, look upon them not as symbols of a collapsing regime, but as fathers, sons, brothers, men caught in tides beyond their control? Even decades after the war, when their hair had turned white and their voices softened with age, the former prisoners spoke of that winter morning with the same wonder they had felt then. They did not remember the exact temperature, or the number of parcels, or the names of the civilians. They remembered the feeling, a warmth that cut through the cold, not of climate but of the spirit. And maybe that is why the story endures, not because it rewrites the brutality of war, but because it reveals something stubborn and fragile within it, a thread of humanity running quietly beneath the noise of nations. A reminder that even amid barbed wire and watchtowers, a small gesture can alter the course of a man's life. For many of those POWs, the gifts became more than objects. They became proof that the world they returned to could still be repaired. Proof that forgiveness was not weakness. Proof that the future did not have to inherit the bitterness of the past. And so, the story closes where it began, in a quiet camp beneath a pale winter sky, where strangers stepped forward not with judgment, but with kindness. A moment of light in a darkened world. Brief, yes, but bright enough to be remembered for a lifetime.